on YouTube. You can go ahead and start.
All right. Hello, everybody who can hear us and can see us. I'm Mark Lipovetsky, and next to me is Daria Ezerova, and we are coordinators of the Russian Film Club at Columbia. And Russian Film Club this year undergoes certain changes due to the inevitable effect of the COVID pandemics. And there are two changes. First change is that we are not going to screen films as we did last year due to technical difficulties with screening through Zoom. But we will have panels like this one, and Dasha and I, we decided to have these panels focused on the most debatable topics of contemporary cinema in Russia. And as you probably know, if you are here, our first topic will be about the film project DAU. We'll have other debates, and they will be happening on the monthly basis. So our next event will be about the film Binpol Dilda. Then we'll have the event about new Russian TV series, and the event about new Russian genre cinema and the film text. Um, Also, another change is that beginning this year, Russian Film Club is a part of the greater series under the auspices and run by the Harriman Institute, Columbia University, which we decided to call Contemporary Culture Series, and which will highlight innovative forms of culture in Russia, former Soviet Union, and different Russophonic communities in diaspora. So this is the beginning of some new cycle in our life, and as everything happening this year, it is a form of an experiment, which we are beginning now with your participation. And I forgot to introduce Daria properly. Daria is a postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute, and I'm a professor of Slavic studies at Columbia University. I think that Dasha will continue here,
right? Yes. So before I say a few introductory words about DAO, I don't think it's really possible to kind of introduce this project in its entirety. Two things just occurred to me. The first one, if you were following our events last year, we dedicated the last year's film series to Russian cinema between protests, that is to say between 2012 and 2019. And this film series is what we can only call New Russian Cinema because it covers 2019 and 2020. So we're actually talking about the last 500 days of Russian cinema is what we're going to be talking about today. And this semester. And one thing about DAO, I think it's a perfect project to start our discussions with, because even in the old format, there would be no way for us to screen DAO in a way that would give our participants and visitors a full picture of the project, right? So I think it's the chosen format for this semester is really great for projects such as DAO. So I'm going to be brief about the project itself. I'm sure most of the attendees heard about DAO. It's been described and probably seen some of it. Hopefully, it's been described as an absolutely unique project, kind of a multimedia art endeavor, unique in the Russian context and in the global context. The project took approximately 15 years to accomplish. It was truly shrouded in mystery for most of those years. The access to the enormous set built just outside of Kharkiv in Ukraine was extremely limited, and those few who did manage to visit the set had to go through a sort of initiation process in which they had to assume the personality of the time when DAO took place. And the initial release of DAO, again, I'm debating the word release here because it's not just a film. It's really is a kind of a multimedia immersive experience. Was in Paris last winter across several platforms and several institutions. And then some of the films, particularly notably DAO Degeneration and DAO Natasha, were released earlier this year with a series of scandals and allegations about certain ethical practices on the set that followed shortly after the release of those films. And right now, those of you who would like to watch more of DAO can watch it on the special streaming platform dedicated just to DAO. So now the project has sort of gone through a multimedia art installation to sort of kind of a classical film form to essentially a streaming project, right? So I'm going to stop here, and I think we're going to introduce our panelists.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to add that as of now, I'd say 8 films from the project have been released, and the authors, and of course Ilya Khrzhanovsky, the director of this project, says that there will be 14 films and several miniseries, right? And so we are just trying to make a judgment about half of the project, but some of our participants, they saw more than it is released now, and probably they will mention this themselves. And before, just one other word before we start introducing our panelists and give the floor to them, only interfering with our questions and brief comments, is that the audience, please send us your questions. If you are watching us on Zoom, there is a button at the bottom of the Zoom screen which says Q&A. So use this button to send the question. If you are watching us on YouTube, please use the chat function. So you only, unfortunately or fortunately, can ask questions in the written format, and our panelists and we will try to answer them after we will have our first round of discussion, so to speak. And so now let's introduce our esteemed speakers.
Yeah, so joining us today is Sophie Pinkham, who's a writer specializing in Russian Ukrainian culture, history, and politics. Her book, Black Square Adventures in Post-Soviet Ukraine, came out in 2016. She's a prolific writer, and her articles and essays have appeared in the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, The Nation, N+1, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times. I'm pretty sure I'm missing quite a few more, but I'm just going to stop here, Sophie. She received a PhD from Columbia University in Slavic languages and literatures, and from what I hear, has seen a substantial portion of DAO films.
Our next guest is Alexander Genis, and he doesn't need to be introduced, but nevertheless, a Russian-American writer, broadcaster, and cultural critic. His career started in New York, where he met and worked with Joseph Brodsky and Sergei Dovlatov and many other celebrities of Russian immigration in the United States. Since 1990, he has written more than a dozen books that are non-fictional bestsellers in Russia, and he's also for this entire period, he is the anchorman of the weekly radio shows, different radio shows on Radio Liberty. Most famous is American Hour with Alexander Genis. He's also a contributing writer for the main liberal Russian newspaper, Novaya Gazeta. And last but not least is Max Lawton, who is a translator, novelist, and a PhD student in the Department of Slavic Languages at Columbia University, and he has recently finished the translation of 3 of Vladimir Sorokin's novels, which I want to announce in order to keep the public waiting for them to appear. Some of his translations appeared of shorter work by Sorokin appeared in the online magazine N+1. All right, so we are done with the introductory part, and let's move to the first question, and we would ask our guests to speak on this, and we'll start from there. So as Dasha mentioned that Khrzhanovsky had designed DAO as a unique project, as something unseen of in the world cinema, right? And the scope of this project is incredibly impressive, and the methods are quite unique. How do you assess the design, the intention, the project? We all know famous Akhmatova's phrase about the величие замысла, the greatness of the intention. So do you recognize величие замысла here?
And what do you think Khrzhanovsky was thinking he was trying to achieve? So whoever.
Sophie, would you please begin?
Yes, I would be happy to begin. Well, I mean, he started off trying to make a relatively traditional movie that had relatively traditional forms of funding. As far as I understand, it had European funding, it had funding from the Russian government, and it was going to be a relatively normal, sort of more or less 2 hours historical film. And then obviously it went way over sort of the time, way over budget. He had to give back the money and then got a new funding source, which, as it turned out after years of secrecy, was the oligarch Sergei Adonyev. And that sort of allowed him. And I think, and I'm starting off with the funding question, because having spent a lot of time thinking about DAO, I think that the nature of the funding and what that enabled is an absolutely crucial part of understanding it. I don't think that it's appropriate to sort of analyze Khrzhanovsky's artistic intentions without thinking about the climate that made these artistic intentions possible. But so with this more or less unlimited, absolutely immense fund of money, he was able to create this huge set in Kharkiv and make it sort of a conceptual art experiment that was very immersive at the time as well. And so for me, one of the main questions about the nature of his project is whether it should even be considered really a film project, because I think that the films in a way are, I almost have the feeling that they're a byproduct of an experiment that was much more about the people who were spending time there, Khrzhanovsky's own experience, whatever it may have been. I mean, we don't have that much access into how he felt necessarily as he was living in this bizarre alternate universe for many years. All of the, I think even hundreds at least of sort of cast members and also crew who were involved, the many visitors, because it also functioned as a kind of almost a theme park. So I think that's the first question: is to what extent is this even a film project? And I'll leave it there.
So then probably we'll try to respond to it. Maybe colleagues will try to respond to it as well. Alexander, as far as I know, you've been at the first screening of the film, and so maybe you have a deeper insight into the intentions and the design of it.
Khrzhanovsky invited me to Berlin, and they showed me 3 days of full day screening of this series. It was absolutely crazy time, crazy place. And it happened in the theater, which was named by Maxim Gorky. And everything inside were very, very Soviet, including a lot of meat preserve and some old furniture like Stalin desk, something like this. And even the cafeteria was very special because the menu was very Soviet, borscht and pelmeni, Russian dumplings. And I asked, who is the cook here? They said, we have a very special cook, the chef who was the personal chef of Poroshenko. I can't understand how they got this, but it was strange. And there were a lot of young people, mostly nice young girls who never been in the Soviet Union, so they don't have any idea what was really life in the Soviet Union, as well as Khrzhanovsky. He is a very young and he looks much younger than he is. I always ask him, do you really allowed to watch this porno? because that's a lot of sex in these movies. So when you ask what was the idea of Khrzhanovsky, I asked him the first time, what is this? He said, nothing, whatever you want to put it, that's it. I go, okay, what's the name of it? That's no name. Every movie was without name. Every film without title. I said, how you can understand which is which? I go, it's your problem. So it was very difficult to find out anything. I said, do you have some materials? Can I read something about this? Said, no, nothing, just watch. And that's what I did. And I watched it. And some things were very difficult to understand, especially one film, which was in Greek language. Can you imagine? It was the whole,
days,
no
right?
subtitles.
It's called 3 days, right?
It was about DAU and his wife, but it was in Greek. And I asked, can we put translation? They said, okay, no problem. And they put German translation. So it wasn't easy for me at all. And there were very few people in the auditorium, maybe 10, 12, but half of them were monks. So it was a lot of strange things. There were monks, Russian monks from Greece. I can't explain anything. And
were they invited by Khrzhanovsky, or did they?
Yes, no. Everyone, there will be people were invited. That was special invitation. We all signed with our blood that we don't tell anybody to anyone. Mm-hmm. It was very, very strictly. And when you came to the place, you have to go through the people who checked your documents, make you pictures, whatever. And it was German people who never do something like this because they were young and they didn't know what is Germany. So they supposed to learn how to be crude. And everything was strange, but there were a lot of people who made this movie, actors. They were inside too. So I spoke to many of them, and I asked, is it really painful to be in this movie? And they say, oh, of course, it's very much painful, but it's a nice thing to know yourself. I really don't understand what does it mean, but some people, one of the girl was a waitress, and she was a waitress even in this cafeteria, but she was in a movie, and everyone who was in the movie was very natural. I never seen in my life so this kind of actors. If you think that it's a movie, it's the best actors ever. But the other question, is it a movie? Can we talk about this like a series of films? And I don't know the answer for this. I think that the best, what we can call it, the project, how they call themselves. And this project is absolutely, from my point of view, it's the most provocative and most interesting project of the 21st century. Nothing like this.
But Sasha, how do you reconstruct the intention, the design? Khrzhanovsky can slip away. He always does. But we as cultural critics,
what do you think he wanted to say?
This.
He wanted to make Soviet Disneyland about KGB. And they wanted to provoke people to behave themselves as it's a real thing. And I have some friends who work there, some musicians, and I ask them, do they really have you, what did you make to do? I go, nothing, play and drink vodka. I ask you, is it real vodka? I go, whatever you want, vodka or water, it depends on what your taste is. And but something is very difficult to watch. That's a terrible situation, and especially at the end. The whole story is 30 years old. How they spend the 30 years of institute, of project, of DAU. And it started with before the war, and that's a lot of very difficult to watch scene about KGB, how they work with people. And the people who are playing KGB, KGB agents, they're chief wardens of the prison. One chief warden of women prison and another of men prison. They're real people. And they knew their work very well. You can see it, how it's absolutely terrible. The first that I've seen was called Brave Men. And it was brave people, yeah. It was absolutely terrible. It was very difficult to watch. And after that, this movie changes like a tree, you know. It started with small, and after that, it became wide and different, and in the all directions. I think that it's like Ulysses Joyce, by Joyce, because every episode is different style, different people to work on it, and it's about different things. Some of that about incest, another about homosexual relationship between two men. And I said, how do you call it? They said, Sasha and Valera. I said, it's better to call it Romeo and Romeo. They say, no, don't start with this. And it's all is obscene language. And I never advise to anybody to watch it. But if you do, you'll have another experience of everything. And it's important. It's change you. Why? I don't know if we really need to be changed this way, but it's definitely change your appreciation of the Soviet Union. You better understand what a terrible place we lived all, most of us. And I think that's important.
Before we move to Max, I just have one question for Alexander. So you mentioned that you think he created a Disneyland about the Soviet Union and Disneyland about the KGB, which I think is a very fitting description, especially kind of, the set itself, this, simulacra. But my question is, Disneyland for who? For whom, rather?
For people who never experienced.
Who is experiencing?
Yeah, never experienced it. For example, I'm sure that my parents, they will never see it and don't want to do it. Mm-hmm. And Mark, yours too, right? It's not for people, for old people, because they knew it's very well, it's too well. But it's not even for me, it's for the next generation. And of course, it's for foreigners. That's what DAU is about. He wanted to show it in Berlin. It's a very special way. He wanted to build the wall again. And in Berlin, real wall. Not very big one, but real wall, like Trump. And he wanted to build it in the middle of the Berlin. And it was a lot of talk about this. When I came there, it was discussion in the municipal organs. And they decided that, no, we have enough of walls. So they moved to Paris. But they still wanted to make international happening. And they, of course, did. And got a prize in Berlin Festival. And people talk about it. And I don't know how it will work next, but it's still alive and it's living right now. I heard that recently the Soviet government forbid to show 4 movies, and including the one about incest and the one about homosexual relationship. I asked recently, I talked with Ilya, we have a big conversation on TV, RTVI, and I asked him, it looks to me like you make a Russian or Soviet version of very famous English TV series, Upstairs, Downstairs. And he said, yeah, something like this, because you have people who are on the top and they drink cognac, and people on the down, they drink very bad vodka. But that's a middle, and middle is you, the viewers. It's the middle people, not on the top, not on the down. And how do you behave during this, watching this stuff, is a part of the project. So it's interesting.
Okay. Thank you, Alexander. Max, it's your turn.
Sure. Well, I guess it would be insane to disagree with Sophie that there are some fairly enormous ethical issues with the some of the creation and some of the allegations that came out. So I suppose it's important to recognize that is a part of how I think all of our reception probably should be, and that we should control for that. We should factor that in. That should be something that does sort of influence how we view and assess the films. I also think that it's important to just look at it as an aesthetic object. There was an interesting interview with Konstantin Bogomolov, a couple weeks ago, where he said that he felt that he could not sort of judge the movie purely as an aesthetic object because the product itself reflected the process of creation. So that by watching the movie, you're asked to think about how it was created. So you can't just view it as an aesthetic object in the same way that if you have a book in your hand. And I think that's very apt. However, if we were to attempt to forget about the process of creation and to just look at it as an object as it exists now, then I would also agree with what Sorokin said in the editorial that he published relatively soon after the film had its premiere in Paris, that it's not cinema. Why is it not cinema? Well, essentially because the scenarios unfold at the tempo of real life, at the tempo at which the people speak, at the tempo at which they act. So sometimes if you watch some of the movies, it's very dull, right? Because some of the people are not interesting. They speak at great length. For example, String Theory. I don't know if anyone watched that one, but it was quite long for what was contained in it, I would say. But some other movies, depending on the person you're watching, can be quite engaging. And so in that sense, I would say it almost does operate more like reality TV in a kind of way. But it's sort of like reality TV shot with a golden camera, because obviously the German cinematographer, whose name is escaping me right now, who shot it. Yeah. Yeah. He really, I mean, he has a golden touch with how it looks. So there's a way in which it operates as reality television, but just like the filet mignon of reality television, in the sense that what you're watching, but also a very extreme version of reality television, right? Because the things that happen are not, they tend to be sort of accelerated into extreme territory. And I think that's where you see probably Ilya's hand the most, is pushing these scenarios not into just like sitting and drinking, but, people having sex or people fighting. I think that's also where the ability to view it as a pure aesthetic object breaks down, right? Like in Degeneration, there was the American artist who was invited, who I think the tensions between him and the neo-Nazis were stoked, and that wasn't controlled. And that was, I just found very painful to watch. And I found it to be not necessarily reflective of a Soviet experience, but more of a post-Soviet experience and an uncontrolled environment, which was sort of unethical. So I guess on par, it's very strange to view it all as one thing, right? Because I've probably watched 20 hours of it, maybe 25, which is a lot. And I feel like depending on the movie, I could have radically different thoughts and radically different impressions, and especially depending on the character I watch. Because depending on the character who the movie focuses on, it could be really stultifying or really fascinating. And like Alexander was saying, it could be very absorbing and the performances are really realistic. And then the next moment you can suddenly be like, it's watching a surveillance camera. So I think in that sense, how do we look at the question, Mark? The intention, and like how do we translate that phrase? The grandiosity of the intent, right? And I wonder, so I think it's on the one hand, grandiose, of course. I mean, the fact that he built this place. But on the other hand, it's quite provincial in a certain way, right? That's like Sorokin's, the chapter in Teluria about this, literally the ultra-Stalinist Soviet Republic, which is just DAU. He just wrote essentially a chapter about how much he hated DAU in Teluria, essentially, where it's, with Patrick and Engelbert, if you recall. There's a whole, of course, Teluria nailed storyline, but it's about a little Soviet Disneyland, Stalinist Disneyland, built by oligarchs for them to amuse themselves and hang around. And, it's just viewed as something very silly. So I think on the one hand, grandiose in terms of managerial scale. On the other hand, maybe provincial and its sort of outlook, and the fact that if you watch enough of the movies, you feel the mechanisms beginning to act, right? It's like, oh, they've transgressed. Okay, here comes the big bad KGB guys, and they're going to interrogate them, and then there's going to be an awful scene of degradation, which I don't really want to watch. And I think maybe the best movies are the ones that actually feel more organic. For example, Natasha, the most infamous one because of the second half. I found the second half to be very difficult to watch. And Alexander, you said that the KGB agent in that, I don't know if you're referring to that one, was realistic. But I found him to be unrealistic. I don't know, I'm American. I was born after the fall of the Soviet Union, but I found that to be weirdly stilted. And like when he kisses Natasha at the very end, I found that to be very strange and artificial. However, the first half when it was Natasha and Olga, the two waitresses talking and drinking together, I found that to be mesmerizing and electrifying because it felt true. So I guess, I don't know. And maybe my final point would just be that I think one of the most interesting things about it is the way in which he does sometimes get people to admit to themselves. So this is one thing which is arguably unethical, but it's also fascinating, which is not the scenes of degradation or abuse, but more like when he puts an American academic in a scenario with, around a dinner table with neo-Nazis, and some of the American academic is saying incredibly terrible things. Or when he gets Tisak, is sitting with the head KGB guy. What's the guy's name? The main Ajipa, yeah. Mm-hmm. And they're sitting together and they're discussing how they've tortured people in the past. That I think is horrible, right? It's absolutely horrible, but it's also fascinating in a way that I don't think is unethical, because it's just getting people to admit to themselves at a real tempo, at a real pace, in a way that you just, I don't know. I don't quite know why, but I found that to be fascinating. The more Disneylandish kind of like fabricated tortures or, interrogations, I could have done without. But when you have people in a closed environment and behaving in interesting ways that are not, abusive, I found that to be interesting. So cinema, not cinema, I think it's reality TV with a golden camera. And, if that's okay, that's an interesting thing. If Peter Greenaway wants to shoot Love Island, I'll watch it.
I would too. Okay, well, thank you for the first round of questions, and we're going to move further to the format of the project. As Genis was mentioned before, it premiered as kind of a multimedia installation, and truly the only appropriate word is project, right? So the question is, how essential do you think is the immersive experience for understanding DAU? And with a follow-up to that, what is lost or perhaps gained by transforming what it was supposed to be into essentially an on-demand streaming format? We can go in the same order that we just went, Sophie, if you...
Yeah, maybe can I just respond to a couple of things from the last?
Sure, absolutely. That would be even better, right?
Brought up that I would like to sort of unpack more. Mm-hmm. So first of all, is just the question of sort of, it's about the Soviet Union, but it's also like a reality show. And I agree that both of those possibilities are present in the project, but what is going on when they're combined? Because obviously these people are not Soviet people, right? They're contemporary people. Most of them are Russian or Ukrainian people. A few of them, including DAU, played by a Greek actor, are foreign. Some of them are American visitors who are very obviously contemporary American visitors, like this guy Andreychak, who it appears was actually assaulted by the actual neo-Nazis who were a major part of the filming process. And I mean, the presence of the neo-Nazis, let's not gloss over that too quickly. A significant number of the major performers in this project are in real life neo-Nazis, one of whom recently died in prison, whose one of their main activities was sort of recording videos. Interesting that they were interested also in recording videos in which they humiliated gay men and various other marginalized people in Russia. They would assault people. It seems like they probably assaulted this performance artist, this American performance artist, who I think is gay. And they're in the film. And for me, the whole project broke down when, there are interesting things about it, as Max pointed out, like it does feel real often and it can be very riveting. But for me, the whole project broke down in the scene in Degeneration, which is 6 hours and is chronologically the end of the project. When, first of all, these neo-Nazis are so palpably neo-Nazis from contemporary Russia. Like they feel exactly like the scariest, worst people you've ever met in contemporary Russia. They have nothing to do with the Soviet Union, right? And they're there and they're just sitting there espousing their contemporary neo-Nazi beliefs and their contemporary racist beliefs about Black Americans and other topics. This performance artist is I think in reality, visibly extremely uncomfortable and upset, and is trying to get away from them. And I didn't go into the project knowing that much about it. And so I was watching this and I was just like, what is going on? Who are these people? And I started Googling and I'm like, oh my God, they're actual neo-Nazis. This is really horrifying. And at that point, the project was no longer at all about the Soviet Union. It had nothing to do with recreating the Soviet Union. It had to do with exploiting our own cliches about the Soviet Union and how horrible it is, but with real actors. And I think it actually kind of loses, in a way, the interest of a real reality show like Love Island, because everyone is sort of play acting, but with varying degrees of success. So at a certain point in the movies, like I just couldn't maintain any disbelief if that's what I was supposed to be maintaining. I just thought, these are neo-Nazis who are dressed up in allegedly authentic Soviet costumes. What am I watching? And also there's also an element of hardcore porn in this, which I think is also very much not about the Soviet Union and is very, very much about the contemporary situation. And I mean, at least one of the principal performers was recruited by the casting director on the basis of an internet porn video.
I think that's Olga, actually.
Yeah, it's Olga. Yeah.
Natasha. So she's a fairly major character in the film.
Yeah, she's one of the main performers, and I actually I think that she's one of the most charismatic people. And for me, she was one of the most engaging of the performers, actually. And I don't have a problem ideologically with her having performed in pornography before, but I think it's pretty telling that they were casting from internet porn. I think that says a lot about the nature of the project. So I think that those are important considerations.
If I may, I want to react to what Sophie said. And then,
yes. And we actually do have a question about controversies. So
Sophie, are you okay? I want to follow up and in certain ways to disagree with Sophie, because I watched Degeneration last, and it actually explained to me as far as I can understand, the concept of this project. And indeed, these neo-Nazi characters, they are contemporary, and they are supposed to be so, because first of all, Khrzhanovsky says that they were not initially designed there. They sort of entered the set and started acting there, and sort of he followed their lead, which is of course very questionable. But if we read this institute with creative geniuses and with sort of everyday life, that of course included sex, right? And the Soviet representation of life didn't include sex, but probably Soviet life and Soviet life in the 60s especially was very much sexualized, right? So we cannot completely ignore this, and so along with the revealing the violence that is hidden in the Soviet imagery, they're also revealing the sexuality that has been there, right? And brutal forms of sexuality as well. But basically, as far as I understood this design and concept from the standpoint of the generation, is that indeed in this everyday life of the creative collective of scientists and their women, and where they sort of basically constantly move from boards with formulas, and we are told that they're actually meaning something. Of course, for me, they mean nothing. They're just some magic words, right? To very much explicit sexual scenes and very long and boring scenes with conversations and drinking. But all this scenes, all this life is sort of intertwined with violence, as Alexander said, right? And KGB indeed is a very important part of this attraction, right? And KGB appearance, KGB interference. But then sort of what we see, if this is a big metaphor of the Soviet Union, right? And then the Soviet Union sort of breaks into the pure violence, right? When KGB man, as it happens in Generation, replaces the director of the institute, who may be corrupt, may be immoral, but he is one of scientists, right? He's one of this creative team. And then comes this this actually the same character and the same actor who plays Natasha and who tortures Natasha. He becomes the director of the institute, and he starts the campaign of terror, right? And that's when this group of Marcinkevichus arrives and sort of does what it does. So basically, it is sort of the attempt to metaphorize the story of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union, right? But I don't know if you're buying this. And let's return to.
I actually want
question.
to interject because I
Sure,
disagree strongly.
Okay.
Well, I agree with the kind of the arc of, you know, violence dissolving into violence and then reducing to further violence. But I will say that I agree with Sophie on two things about certain participation, certain images in the film that might color your perception of it. So the use of Tisak and other neo-Nazis presumably was done to make it realistic, because the entire pursuit of the project appears to be to dispel the artifice to a certain extent, right? Like to make it fully, you know, full reconstruction and make it as realistic as possible, while at the same time making it a Disneyland. So there is a way to do it that doesn't involve neo-Nazis. And there is a way to do it convincingly, right? So people usually say that DAU is a unique project. Something very similar was endeavored by Peter Watkins in La Commune, the film about the French Commune, on a slightly smaller scale, but only slightly so. And there was kind of a lot of discussion between the non-professional actors on how to, you know, how to do something that they're even further away from time, make it look realistic, make it look almost like a documentary. So I think there was a way to do it without the involvement of the neo-Nazis. And the other point that I want to make is about porn. Of course, there, you know, like there was sex in the Soviet Union, and in fact, there was a lot of kind of, you know, the sexualization that Mark brought up in the intertwinement with of that with violence. But if I'm talking from a strictly cinematic standpoint, the way that Khrzhanovsky films sex a lot of times is pornographic, not by content but by form, which makes it even more sort of like more insistently pornographic, right? There's obviously a presence of the male gaze. There is the whole, you know, Laura Mulvey's aspect of to be looked at this. It's the constant exploitation of female nudity that is a staple of heterosexual porn since the dawn of time, pretty much, right? There is a way to film it in a way that wouldn't be that way, right? In fact, just a side note, there's been discussions about this among Russian film critics. There is even something now that's called feminist porn, believe it or not. And it looks very different from what we assume when we say porn. Khrzhanovsky doesn't do none of that. He specifically films it in a way pornography works, right? And yeah, so there is the kind of voyeurism that he uses there is actually not documentary at all. It's not a way to kind of capture sort of sex as it is. It is profoundly genre in that way, right? So that actually can tell you some things and then, you know, affect your perception of the reality of the whole project and sort of where is it going with its verite intent.
Yes. So Sasha.
Let me say something about sex, because I asked
and violence, please.
And violence, please. We're only taking two. Like
it's two different questions. And I asked about sex, Khrzhanovsky. I said, why so much sex in your movies? He said, no, it's not enough. It's only 10%. He counted
10% of what?
Of the whole movie. So 10% of contents is sexual in its nature. And I asked him why. And he said that because sex is another state of consciousness, and you have to show people in completely different state of mind and state of body too. And I think that it's important because usually we watch it with another perception, and I think that it's important as a shock for viewers. And it was his idea of provocation. First of all, this is not movie, it's provocation. And another question about reality TV. I don't think that it's really reality TV. I asked him this question too. I asked, is it movie? Is it film of it? Of course, it's all components of real movies. But we did it a little bit different. And this difference, I think that we have to find three important figures, which is very important for the whole project. First of all, that's Vladimir Sorokin, who started all this. And we know Sorokin can be very difficult to read and very naturalistic in this description. The second person who is important to all this project is Anatoly Vasilyev. That's a famous theater director who works on the border between fiction and non-fiction. And it's a very strange persona. I knew him a little bit. He's like a saint. And also he produced very strange things. And he was important. I asked about this. He was important in this project. He worked with them. And the third person who is dead now, it's Alexei German. And his movies was especially Lapshin was very important for Khrzhanovsky. And if we watch all this, remember about these people who was important for Khrzhanovsky, maybe we better understand this difference between reality TV and a movie. It's something else. It's not reality TV, it's not movies, but it's the third dimension, and it's important. And he didn't want just to show us how bad the Soviet Union was. He wanted to show how bad people are. All people, all of them. And his next project, Baby Yar, he wanted to make memorials. What about this memorials that were so scandalous? Because he wanted to show that everybody can be victim or can be one who shoots the victim. And that's exactly what is all this movie about. This project is about how difficult to live if you have absolutely uncivil, unhuman conditions. And this is about everyone. It's not about just Soviet Union. That's because the whole tragedy is that it's provocation of our nature. And I think that's important. That's why it's not only Soviet Disneyland. It's more than this. It started with this, but it went in another direction. And the end of the movie, when we see the last 6 hours, degeneration, let's go, we understand that all people who were before, they're not so bad after all. We can understand them. That's all, they're very weak people. They're very sinful people, but they're still people, not like these neo-fascists who are rats. They're terrible. They're animals. We don't have any common language with them. And that's what makes this movie, this project is really terrible to watch.
So I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to see if Max had something to say on the topic.
But Max, you received the question sort of transformed with the takes on violence and on the human nature, and the sort of immersive character of this project also is at the table. So so you have
they're
a
all
very
interrelated. So
well, I have
connect this all.
I have 3 thoughts. Which is to do with the idea of the neo-Nazis coming in, which I don't think anyone would object to that if it were a novel or if it were purely fiction, right? That is a fascinating notion that the Soviet Union gave way to this sort of neo-fascist Eastern European thing, which that's not even controversial, right? I think every theorist of, I mean, I'm not a historian or a theorist of the area, but I think that that's not a controversial hypothesis that the Soviet Union gave way to a certain kind of very damaging rightism in the region. But I think that the issue would be more like actually having the neo-Nazis there and like letting them or egging them on to sort of torment people makes it loaded in a way that it wouldn't be, right, if it were just fiction. So I think that's the complexity, that maybe the theoretical construction is interesting, or that the plot itself, it makes sense, but that the execution is, again, like Bogomilov's point, you can't just view it as an idea or a plot because it's real in a very profound way, that you just see these guys, doing pretty hateful things. And as for the reality TV, not film, I absolutely agree with that. And I guess I agree that, we talk about forms evolving and something becomes what it isn't anymore, right? So people would have said, oh, Ulysses isn't a novel, Finnegan's Wake isn't a novel. And most recently, I think, if we think of the Knausgaard novel, My Struggle, which is the, 4,000-page autobiography that is a novel, but also not. I think that's maybe a salient thing, which is these sort of generic conventions breaking down in a way that isn't always neat. And I guess I agree with that. I guess when I say it's not cinema, I think what I'm referring to is that for me, cinema is about a certain kind of, you have to be laconic in a certain respect, right? There has to be a sense of time unfolding and motions unfolding and words unfolding in a sort of streamlined way. And I think the reason I would personally say that DAU, for not always, some of it is cinematic and some of it is riveting, is that there's just a lot of dead time where I don't feel any intention. I don't feel anything really happening. I kind of feel like, this is just people filming themselves talk or do stuff. And I think there's just too much dead time for me. And you could feel the difference, right? I don't know who watched Imperia, Empire. Alexander, you did, right? The one with Vasilyev, the one about the previous director of the Institutes, and DAU talks to him. It's like 8 hours of conversations. It was online very briefly. But there's one scene from the DAU 1, right? That's the thing we're not talking about, which is that there's a DAU 1, which is about how he meets his wife and moves to the Institute. And the difference is really weird, because if you're watching Empire, it's like these scenes we're used to, shot in a very realistic way with natural lighting, and sort of like this moderately shaky handheld camera. And then suddenly we snap to a previous conversation with DAU and Vasilyev, where they're on this hill, that all the people are walking up the hill, but the camera is put sideways so that it doesn't look like they are. So it's a very strange effect. And that's a much more cinematic conversation, because you feel the intent of the director come through in a punchier way that for me is more cinematic. I respect and recognize that you can have different intentions and different means of articulating your intentions that do not accord with convention. My issue is just that too much of it is dead time, and too much of it just sags very sort of just into nothing. So that would be my critique.
So Max has already moved into our next question about the sort of materialization of the project, right? And Alexander mentioned three names: Sorokin, German, and Vasilyev. And I would say that the absence of Sorokin is very felt here, right? Because as we know, Sorokin was intended actually even I think wrote the
he did
the script for the film, but then it all transformed to something.
Started the whole project.
Yeah, because I agree with Max here that the conversations between heroes are full of verbal garbage, right? And one can say that's how people speak in real life, but that's exactly the problem, that it is not the real life. It's still the cinematic experience, immersive experience. And if we would imagine that Sorokin would script all dialogues in all these 14 movies, which he probably would never do, that would be a completely different story, right? And the same goes to the opposite example of German, right? So in German, we hear a lot of verbal noise, but this is a very much, I would say, orchestrated verbal noise. Here, this verbal noise becomes the foreground, and that kills many effects, right? So to make this conversation more focused, maybe I will slightly rephrase the question that we have, and I would ask: so which of the movies from what you've seen you would call the best one and the worst one?
Excellent. And why?
Yeah, of course. So, Sophie, traditionally, would you like to begin with this? The best,
sure.
Or the best and the worst?
There are so many of them. They really
so many of them so good
after a while.
so
But
bad.
I actually also think that Brave People was one of the best. I thought it was one of the most interesting. I thought the performers were really compelling. And actually, it's interesting to think about the sex scene in that one, because I thought that was one sex scene that was not filmed with a very noticeable kind of pornographic intention. And I totally agree with what Dasha said about it not being just the fact of showing sex, because obviously there was sex in the Soviet Union, but the way it was filmed in the idiom of porn. But I think that there was a sex scene that was not filmed in the idiom of porn, and it was very, for me, not deeply unenjoyable to watch, but in a way that had some kind of interest connected to the characters. And I thought that the physicist, Andrei Losev, who is the main character, was really poignant, and it was sort of emotionally interesting and emotionally felt real, and was lacking in sort of the blatant anachronisms that, for me at least, were really distracting and unpleasant. And then the worst, I kind of thought Natasha was the worst, but I don't know if it's just because I watched it last. I thought the dialogue was just really fake and sort of overwhelmingly banal, and it felt very openly exploitative to me.
Okay. I actually also liked Brave People most. And
I like Katya Tanya
oh, okay.
also.
Oh.
I thought it was kind of more easier to watch for sure. Again, slightly kind of pornographic angle again, but more leaning not towards pornography, but more sort of like blue is the warmest color we're talking there, and not just because it's two women, just the way it is shot. I thought it was more manageable, let's put it this way. But of course it is entirely staged. Katya Tanya is probably the one that I would call the most non-kind of verite, non-real, non-kind of this is reality, we're reconstructing something that's very real. The film is totally scripted and staged.
It's hard to talk about them too, because they have so many different directors, and the styles are so strikingly different, and they're edited in different ways. So
thank you. Alexander, what's your most...
I agree with Sophie, because I think that Brave People is the most important part, because it's the beginning. It's what they show everybody to start this project. And you understand, yeah, they started to show people with this one. And I understand why. Because you understand how the play will go, you know, the rules of game. And you understand it very well. And for people who live in the Soviet Union, we always live with such ideas. Not everybody experienced something like this, but everybody knows somebody who experiences. And it's difficult to explain, but you always live with people like this. And it's very realistically, and I think that it's very talented to make it. It's dull. All of this is dull, but it's a part of life, because it's supposed to be dull, because you see how gray the life is in this system. And the worst part for me, maybe the last one, Degeneration. It's 6 hours, and it's terrible to watch, especially when they cut the swine. And I think that the hawk, and I think that it's the end of the movie. They must to find somehow to finish all this. And this is not organic. It's violent, because they want to show something so terrible that nothing can be more. So they make fire of this institute. They killed everybody. And the slogan of this neo-fascists, that sounds so stupid, for future of our white children. It sounds silly to me. I don't know. Maybe it's some kind of neo-fascist joke, but it sounds very stupid. And I think this is too long and too strong and too artificial for the end. It's not organic. I think that they don't know what to do else with all this, and the money is finishing, and it's time to somehow close this part of their life. And that's why I'm not sure that I like it. But it's so big that you can always find something interesting. Even in this movie, that's interesting how these people like sport. Sport is their religion. And I understand these people. I understand who are they. Because it's like in Russia, sport, it's like gun for Americans. It's something sacred. And people who make this Sporadic guys they call titushki in Ukraine during the Maidan. the people who killed everybody, who beat everybody, they were very sportsmen. And they call them titushki. So that's neo-fascists, that's titushki. And they looks like titushki. So I think that you always can find something interesting. You know, it's like War and Peace. You can be dull, but it's so many of it that you find some interesting part anyway.
It's like War and Peace. I like this this comparison.
Definitely long. Max, what do you think?
For me, I think there's kind of a cheat, and actually, we didn't talk about this one because
Yeah.
it circumvents. Well, no, it's a cheat because it's the movie that circumvents the problems. It doesn't have any ethical problems. It's Nora Mama. That one I thought was so good, and I was shocked that that's the real mom of the actress. Because
she was very organic.
Yeah, what he captures and sort of the energy and the way it's filmed, I just felt like it was a great Fassbinder movie. So that one for me, I mean, it's a cheat because it doesn't have any KGB stuff at all, and because it's sort of the one that's most elliptical. And also, I think maybe the best representative of if you were going to articulate a sort of directorial manifesto for Ilya would be this sort of like organic, inorganic, right? Fake, real. And what would be the best representative of that for me would be DAU, would be the guy, the character DAU, because he doesn't speak Russian.
Theodore Kurentzis?
Yeah, exactly. Theodore Kurentzis, because he is mesmerizing to watch. His energy is very interesting on camera, but it's horribly unrealistic because he speaks accented, occasionally agrammatical Russian. So that I thought was the most interesting thing. And I thought the thing that lands sort of the best. And I was disappointed that he wasn't in more parts that were made public, because that was definitely my favorite, even though it might circumvent some of the more difficult questions you've been asking. My least favorite, for ethical reasons, would be Degeneration, just because, especially in like the 4th and 5th hour, the neo-Nazis bullying I found to be unwatchable. And for just aesthetic reasons, it would be String Theory, because I think that's the one that reveals the sort of flabbiness of the project the most. It was just so much dead time. That's the worst part, actually, when you talk about this either. He recycles parts from other movies, which is like, why are there recycled parts that I've seen before in other movies? And it makes me feel like the number of movies hasn't been created out of aesthetic or artistic necessity, but just to kind of like bump the numbers up. So String Theory is the worst from the aesthetic perspective, and Degeneration from an ethical.
But I think that this recycling is part of the principle, because, for instance, the Degeneration's plot, at least final part of this plot, is repeated in the New Man.
Yeah,
it's exactly the same.
I didn't like that. I didn't like that recycling either, I guess, but it might be a principle of.
I think there is something there that suggests this sort of stereoscopic perspective. You can see different situations from different perspectives. Same situation from different perspectives. I'm sorry.
No, I just wonder why one needs to recycle anything if you have 700 hours of footage. But no, I just wanted to make a sort of a quick comment for what we're talking about. 2 comments. First, we mentioned the word the unwatchable a few times, and it so happens that it actually is a term in film studies. There was recently a book of the same title, but I think DAU really redefines the unwatchable for many people in precisely the respects that we brought up. And the second thing, we've been sort of circling around about how the conversation sometimes lapses. What Max, you brought up was sort of like the film feels like it really drags on, and then then the fact that DAU is by far the most unrealistic character. My personal take on all of these paradoxical situations and paradoxical treatments of characters and scenes is that Khrzhanovsky, to me, seems to be torn irreconcilably between a kind of cinema verite ambition and probably the most obsessive directorial control I've seen in Russian cinema in a really long time. And those really don't go together very well. And my personal kind of take on it would be that that's where the many disjunctions come from stylistically. We're not going to talk about ethics right now. Anyway, that was just my comment.
Maybe it's the time to talk about ethics. Or do we want to, or is it relevant at all? You know about scandals surrounding this film, this project, right? And we already spoke, and I think we should speak again, about the violence as the central subject here, as was mentioned by Alexander in the very beginning of our conversation, and in the questions that already arrived is being addressed as well. So is there? I'm not saying justification. Is
redeeming
there? Yes. So is there anything beyond the sort of the subject of the movie that explains violence on the set, if it was there? We don't know that, of course, right? But the atmosphere of violence, is it indeed the part of the immersive experience about which Alexander was saying, right? Is it sort of, was it artistically necessary, right? Of course, we don't have any legal proofs of this violence, right? We know about that, but the buzz is indicative of something, I would say. And in my own explanation, it's sort of the catch-22. So they wanted to sort of expose violence, but they only could do this by creating the atmosphere of violence. So they couldn't do this otherwise, because that would require the artificial construction, and they were trying to avoid artificial construction. And so you see what I mean? It's sort of the as I said, catch-22 that they created by this entire design. So Marx wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, it's just a quick comment, which is that, I mean, I think that paradox doesn't have to be applied to everything, right? For example, like I mentioned this at the beginning, probably the scene that I found to be the most, that I will remember the most, was when Ajipa was talking to Tisak about the ways they've tortured people before, which is horrible, right? But it's about the culture of violence. And I wouldn't consider that to be exploitative, right? Because they're merely talking. They've been put in a situation where they feel like they have the right to talk. They feel like they are in the right. They feel like they're in a situation where they have the right to talk in a specifically discursively Soviet way about acts of extreme violence. And I think that scene makes a very interesting point about language and violence and violence in the state without anyone getting hurt, right? That's about the culture of violence. And that is a very memorable scene and very fascinating and perfectly ethical. Egging, you don't have to egg neo-Nazis on to bully a performance artist to make a movie about a culture of violence. I don't even think it's interesting at a certain, right? Like, it's when you, at a certain point, when you saw the interrogation scenes, I just found them to be boring at a certain point. I mean, like, that's not to say they're not bad, that they were made in the way they were made, but it's like, okay, it's the KGB guys who are swearing in an anachronistic way again. Cool. Got it.
But Sophie, go ahead, please.
Well, I just had the feeling that, and this goes back to Dasha's point about these kind of irreconcilable urges within the project, which is also something that I felt really strongly, that gave it a kind of an incoherence that was very destructive to it as an artistic project. And so one of the many issues raised by that for me was just that you don't really know why people are acting the way they do. And there is a scenario. I mean, there's actually a pretty elaborate plot. It's not like a reality show at all in that way. There's this elaborate plot about Ajipa and the eugenics projects and this and that. But then sometimes you do have this feeling that people are experiencing real fear, for example, and it makes you feel extremely uncomfortable. Sometimes it's really excruciating. Like, there were points where I felt actually afraid for the performers, which was not, I didn't find it an artistically rewarding or aesthetically rewarding experience. But you don't know why. You don't know why it's happening. And it creates such an interpretive problem that, for example, you never have with a German film.
But doesn't it follow from what the colleagues were saying about the immersive experience, right? So if you,
I felt that it actually was the opposite. It created the opposite of an immersive experience because
distancing.
Yeah, because I couldn't be immersed in kind of the aesthetic experience. And I think that one interesting thing about this project is how heavily it relies on all of the stuff that's outside of the film, from sort of the Disneyland aspect and the tourism aspect and the multimedia installation aspect, but then also the huge amount of PR and kind of creation of legends that was very intentional throughout this 15-year project. And if you can, I think that's the really big difference with something like Sorokin or Knausgaard or whoever. I mean, those works do stand on their own really quite well. I mean, you want to know it's autofiction in Knausgaard's case, but Knausgaard hasn't been spending 15 years making a story about himself specifically to attract press that it rests on. And also, you know, something like Sorokin has so much more intention artistically, or German, than I think these movies do, which are so huge and sprawling and messy and sort of unplanned.
But German was filming Hard to Be God for 20 years.
Yeah, but it's so tight. Hard to be a god.
Nazis were not involved in that one.
Oh, it's hard to say.
As far as we know.
Metaphorically, they do. Alexander, please.
I think that we have to explain violence very easily if we remember Antonin Artaud, the Theater of Cruelty, right? And you have to break the wall. He wanted to break the wall. In the theater, we have to break the screen. We wanted to put people inside this claustrophobic space, which is called DAU Institute, and watch what's happening around them. Sometimes it's dull, sometimes it's terrible, sometimes it's very fascinating. But first of all, it's supposed to be fresh and unusual. When I came to Berlin, there was in the theater, there was a lot of flags of banners of different countries who gave money to this project. There were, I think, 15 countries who gave some money for some funds for this movie. And there was one absolutely transparent banner, transparent flag. I asked, what is this? This is DAO. It's the flag of our project because it's transparent. You put whatever you wanted in this. So it's empty. Of course, it's not empty.
It's not.
But that's how Khrzhanovsky wanted to show it. And of course, he is a very PR man. And all this can be happened because he is charismatic personage. And of course, he made a big scandal of all this. And I think that it's kind of art itself in our time to make something so important and something so scandalous and something so difficult to watch and something so interesting to watch. And this is all part of the project. And I think that they didn't finish with this because they wanted to put some very strange ideas. They wanted to make confessional booth in the cinema. Every spectator who came to watch this project can make confession for professional people. Can you imagine? Confession about what? Whatever you wanted. Because it's confessional movie, so it made you to make confession. So they gather a lot of church people around this project and wanted them to work with these people. So I told you that's supposed to be much bigger than it was, but it's still big enough, I think.
So basically you're saying that we watching these films from the privacy of our...
It's not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, we are breaking the effect.
It's supposed to be collective experience. You're supposed to talk about this. You're supposed to cry, laugh. You're supposed to do something, drink vodka. You're supposed to be part of all this happening. And they didn't give him such joy. But in Paris was happening something like this. But they wanted to do it in Berlin. It's very big, supposed to be real something. But they don't want, they said they have enough experience for their lifetime in Berlin.
I think that it's time to turn to questions. So I suggest that Dasha and I will be reading these questions, and one of you should volunteer to answer, and the others may then jump in because we cannot sort of expect everyone asking the same question, and we don't have time for that. We have at least 5 questions here.
We have 6 here and more there.
Sure.
Sorry, I was not pointing at you.
No, it's not pointing. It's pointing at the screen. So the first question: knowing that we do about Khrzhanovsky's controversial approach to the DAO project, how would you characterize the decision to include him in the process of designing the exhibits for the planned Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kyiv. Interestingly, Khrzhanovsky's ideas have also been criticized in media as Holocaust Disneyland, much like the KGB Disneyland discussed tonight. Does anybody want to respond to
Jump
this?
on the question.
It's crazy to do that.
Crazy idea to invite him to do
To do I mean, like, it was. I just wonder who actually made that decision administratively.
And that's also just about oligarchs, and he's like under the protection of Friedman now, and they decided they wanted Babin Yar to be more exciting and glitzy. I mean, I think it's totally horrifying, and I think there's a reason why all of the highly qualified historians left the project as soon as he was brought on, more or less.
But I think that the question contains the answer. So since he created the Disneyland with KGB, so that's the intention to do with Holocaust. But of course, it's much more painful for viewers. So, shall we move to the next one?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all for this discussion. I'm wondering what you think the fact that the project launched in the late 2000s tells us about the appeal of Soviet escapism and the Soviet past in Russia and elsewhere in the post-Soviet and non-Soviet world during the decade. Does this film fit into a larger tradition of reimagining or reliving the Soviet Union in Russian film, literature, and culture that might have consolidated around the time that DAU was being conceptualized?
Excellent question.
Yes, and so in brief, is it a form of nostalgia in a way?
I think that's actually a really interesting question. I was thinking about that a lot. I mentioned it to Mark, although we never ended up talking about it. But, I mean, you can compare it to German, and on the surface, it's all about how horrible the Soviet Union was. But I think that there is an element of really perverse nostalgia. There's actually one scene, I can't remember which film it's in, but it was with the Nazis. It's when the Nazis come and the people in the institute have things are loosening up. It's the 60s. They're trying to have a good time, and they keep listening to Smokey Robinson and dancing, and they're kind of wearing their outfits. And it reminded me really strongly of the movie Stilyagi, which obviously is like the absolute antithesis of DAU, you would think superficially. But I think that there actually is a commonality, and obviously these sort of much sweeter, not uncritical, obviously, but much sweeter, sometimes kind of even almost saccharine depictions of the Soviet Union are so popular now in Russian cinema and on TV. There's so many series. I think it is really useful to think about DAU as also being a part of that.
I guess Alexander wouldn't agree with this interpretation.
No, it's a really interesting question, because first of all, I don't think about it as nostalgic, but I think maybe it is, because what's happening here, that's a huge institute, that's a lot of scientists, and all they live in Russia, not in Columbia University. They're not immigrated, they're still in Russia. Can you imagine the whole institute with real important scientists? And we have to know that all scientists in the movie, real scientists, and everything that they wrote on the the board, it's the real physics. I asked about this. And some of them is Nobel laureate, so it's important people. And when you think about this, maybe it is some nostalgic moment. It's like, of course, Stalin, it's all bad, but we still have huge scientist resources, and no one escaped from Russia to American university yet. Maybe
they were not allowed.
Of course, it's not allowed. But now you can see that there are some Russian scientists in Russia. It's already strange, maybe something like this.
So on from this standpoint, we have. I would say it's not a question; it's rather a commentary from Igor Mandel. From a aesthetic point of view, what's your estimation of the quality of the project? Does it achieve a goal, if any? My main point in the paper that Igor sent to us all, and he is asking whether it's lost in mail, that it was not. It was completely broken aesthetics because structurally everything was a mess. This historic, meticulous detail didn't match the real ones. Non-professional actors couldn't follow convincingly any logical scenario, especially because this scenario didn't exist. As a result, a huge number of scenes and absolutely implausible psychologically, without which any movie will not be valued high. The chaotic structure of the design of the project revealed itself in a chaotic aesthetic result. It doesn't create neither, it creates neither high imaginary effect, as any good metaphor would, nor it creates any real documentary picture of the reality. Those two things are damn mixed in each episode, which makes all that just a very bad movie where your real attention and interest just randomly meet the material. I think we discussed this at length, and only if you guys want to, and Max wants to comment on that. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, because I had a comment about the Soviet nostalgia in relation to this as well, which is that I also think there's an element of kitsch in the project, which is not insubstantial, right? Like, if you've ever been to Vodyanichная Nomer 1 in Russia, like the Russian Soviet Denis, where it's like, have Russian food from the Soviet Union, just like in Soviet times. I do think there's a way in which, like, the fact that there's a canteen serving authentic food, but in another way, it seems profoundly inauthentic. And then also to do with the language, right? So that's a big critique that Sorokin has, which I don't think anyone could disagree with, except from a conceptual perspective, which is that they're all swearing so much. And they're really, it's not, no one spoke like that in the Soviet Union. There's no Soviet terminology really, except for artificially, right? That
Who told you that? No.
No, I mean, people swore, like, but I don't think that from what I read,
I think swearing, I know what Max...
How do you know?
Well, from the linguistic theorists I read, they said that no, people didn't swear to that extent, or they didn't use those sorts of locutions.
I would say something that I think would be kind of like maybe reconcile or maybe do the opposite. People obviously swore, like that to me just is not even a question.
Right.
But I will say that considering that Russian cinema to this day is very strict about any forms of profanities on screen, it is true that a lot of people, when they see sort of all of the mat on screen, will be like, oh my God, no one spoke like that. Yeah, they did. But I did, however, in some scenes found that it just kind of didn't fit, or I cannot explain it, but there are a few moments in Natasha when Natasha swears, and she swears like all other characters, but there are 2 or 3 moments when I'm like, no, that just feels a little off key right here. But that, I cannot explain that. But I definitely swore.
I knew that Alexander has a commentary and even know.
I think that it's important part of the movie, especially one film. It's Sasha and Valera about homosexual love. And it's the whole dialogue, only obscenity, nothing else. But it doesn't, they didn't do it for communication. They do it like bird, like singing. It's something like Tarantino, you know, the same poetry in this. And when it's so often, and there's nothing else. That's only this thing. And you understand that it's not language, it's singing, it's poetry, it's whatever it is, but it's not language. They don't want to explain something. They just don't have another language how to explain that they love each other. It's a very strange thing. And first of all, when I watched it, I think that it's too much. It can be like this. And I worked 2 years as a fireman. I saw some people who swearing a lot, but nothing like this. And I understand that it's because they don't know how to tell about their strange love. And they hit each other, they swear, they almost kill each other, but it's all about love. So it is Romeo and Juliet, but in a very strange way. And I think that it's made it interesting. So you know how much 4 letters word in Tarantino movies. Try to take it away, and you lose all poetry in dialogue, right? So something is this. It's a special effect. It's not just for fun.
Actually, it is interesting that Maria Kuvshinova, who is the most ardent critic of this film, in one of her articles, she says something very similar to what Alexander just said, that Sasha Valera, despite the fact that its language is 90% obscenities, is for some reason is the most touching film that she watched.
I didn't read it, but it's very nice talking and saying, and the end of this movie is very interesting because the guy who came to the restroom and he is praying to God and said that you love everybody. If I love this way, you love me anyway. And it's long, it's dull, but it's very expressive. So it is something, maybe it's the most touching movie from all this part of this project.
Thank you. Another question from Igor Mandel. Why DAU? The name should be changed many years ago when director stopped the original idea with Sorokin. Neither the character of DAU, so the character of DAU is a parody. The character of DAO is a parody of the real DAO or any other scientist. It's misleading, and in his opinion, it's a huge mistake. Do you agree with this?
I don't agree with that. I think that I think the issue a lot of us have seems to be with the coloring within the lines of the project, but like it is about his life. I mean, the plot points do follow his life, and the whole first movie, I think, is going to be, it's kind of, whatever you have to say about it. The real DAO did have the whole open marriage theory, which is why Sorokin initially wanted to write the screenplay about, I think, that sort of his theory of physics intersecting with his theory of free love and his own marriage. So it does follow that broadly. And I don't have any issue. Like I said, I actually like the fact that Theodore Kaczynskis is playing DAO, and I thought that worked very well, despite the fact that when I heard about it, I thought it would be a catastrophe. But I mean, yeah, I even think one of the biggest issues is that not a lot of the movies we've gotten have been about, just aesthetically speaking, a lot of the movies we have gotten haven't been about DAO. And I think DAO 1, I think that'll be interesting to see. The mothership movie.
I think from a practical perspective, it also might be that the project was branded as DAO relatively early on, and then the branding was so strong that it was maybe out of the question to change the title. I would also just point out that there are some other questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm. So do you want me to read it, or do you want to address it? Mm-hmm. So here is the question, which I would like to question from Alice Watson. I'm sorry, we already touched the question about the aspect about nostalgia, but I think a very important part of the question is, can you speak to how DAO might influence modern cinema? And Alice suggests not for the better, but let's leave it open-ended. How this project might influence contemporary cinema. And we would also, Dasha and I were thinking about another question: how does it relate to contemporary cinema?
Yeah, does it fit with anything at all before it, both kind of sort of Russia and globally?
I watched recently this documentary, Chinese documentary about factory workers in like a economically depressed part of China called West of the Tracks. Kind of reminded me a bit of it, because it reminded me of DAO, because it's 9 hours long. They're really engaging parts and they're very boring parts. And I think that it ideally, I think that that's the similar texture of reality, the texture of reality that Ilya wants to capture. I was also thinking about, speaking of modern cinema, Paul Schrader, the guy who wrote Taxi Driver and directed First Reformed last year. He's sort of a art housey figure in Hollywood, has a funny diagram, which is that he has the Tarkovsky ring, right? Outside of which you're no longer making movies for a paying audience. And he writes all these names inside. And he has 3 tendencies. One of them's surveillance camera. One of them is mandala, so like transcendental, prayerful, sort of holy feeling movies, Terrence Malick, for example. And one of them is art gallery. And I feel like DAO is definitely sort of surveillance camera. And there are other directors making sort of slow cinema like that, where you have a sort of feeling of reality unfolding. Lav Diaz, for example. I don't think, like, if you think of Satan Tango, the Bellatar movie. So I don't think that what he's doing is entirely new, in the same way that Knausgaard's My Struggle is autofiction, in the same way that a lot of people have been writing it. I think maybe the way that media works now and the way that exposure has been afforded to it and the way he's marketed it has made it have a certain air of novelty that it maybe doesn't have.
Okay, thank you. Any other response to this question?
I hope that it won't be followed by any other project like this. We finished with this, and I think that it's important part of this achievement. You finish the whole idea. You can be another DAO. It would be stupid, and it would not be funny. But do you know another Ulysses? No, that's finished. If you made something real important, you close the question. And I think that we don't need another DAO. Definitely, I don't need.
We don't have so much time, right?
So much motion.
Sophie, what do you think?
Yeah, I hope there's no other DAO. I think that for practical reasons, there won't be probably, right? And I think so much of it is about the novelty. It's not really about the product, and it would be impractical to recreate it.
What about the influence and relations to that?
I was just going to say that the question of novelty is also, as sort of was hinted upon, is can be debated.
Yeah, I was thinking of just the novelty of, you know, producing 14 movies based on 15 years and spending 25 million euros or however much it was. I didn't mean artistic novelty.
The money novelty.
Yeah.
Budget novelty.
I think we've answered all questions that we had. We didn't answer. So we did address the question about the experience of watching the film. So we didn't articulate it, but that was spoken about. So I think that it's time to wrap it up. And thank you so much for being with us and sharing your ideas about this project. And thank you for those who were with us online in different formats. I hope that it was fun. And as far as I know, we will have the recording of this conversation available later. So if somebody who you know wanted to look at it, we do not mind. Right. Thank you.